Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name's Narina Di Lorenzo, I'm Moreland Council CEO, and I'm absolutely delighted to be your MC tonight. I'd like to start by paying my respects to the Wurundjeri people and acknowledging them as the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Welcome to the 22nd Maurice Blackburn Oration, and also welcome to our viewers at home watching through LIVESTREAM. And welcome to everyone joining us tonight. Thank you for coming. Tonight's oration, The Humanitarian Impact of War, will be delivered by Judy Slatcher, Chief Executive Officer of Australian Red Cross. So we welcome you and thank you for joining us tonight. The origin of this lecture series is founded on the generosity and the spirit of two great Australians, Maurice and Doris Blackburn, and we are so honoured to be holding this ongoing event. And so in that spirit, I take this opportunity to reiterate Council's ongoing commitment to the promotion, protection and enhancement of human rights in Moreland. Now I ask you all, as you settle in for the night, to switch off your mobile phones and be present in the moment with us tonight. And I hope you enjoy the night and that you gain inspiration from tonight's speakers. First up, I would like to introduce Auntie Diane Kerr, Wurundjeri Elder, who will conduct a welcome to country. Welcome, Auntie Di.
Good evening. I honour my ancestors and my elders, and I pay homage to this sacred ground that we're on. I wish to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here. I wish to acknowledge the Blackburn family, the Mayor. I wish to acknowledge all of the special guests, and I acknowledge the people at home and all of you here, and I pay my respects to your ancestors, elders and families. And I'm very honoured to be here, and I don't know how many times I've been here for the oration, but I must be doing something right. I get invited back. But it is an honour to be here, and it's an honour to be able to honour someone and what they've achieved, and particularly with human rights. And I admire the City of Moreland and what they do, as not only as an Aboriginal person, but as a citizen that sees so many different cultures that are looked after in this city. And it's a wonderful thing to see such a multicultural city, and that things are looked at and looked after, and if there's anything wrong, it's brought to the attention and it's not pushed away. And that's what I like here, and I feel very honoured to be here. And sometimes, you know, like we forget in our daily lives how lucky we are that we can come together here without fear of any harm. And that's very special to be able to do that in our lives, particularly in this day and age and in the world that we live in. So I'd like to ask each and every one of you while you're here to share your story of who you are and where you come from. Talk to someone that you don't know and share your story. I firmly believe if we can understand each other's culture, we can live in harmony. When we live in harmony, we eradicate racism and stigma. We pave the way for our children. We make it a better place for them to live, and they can live in peace, and they can walk our streets without fear of any harm. And it's very important that that happens. And all it takes is an open heart and an open hand. So I offer you my hand in friendship so that we can all journey together. May Bunjil, my Creator, surround you all and keep you safe on country. On behalf of my elders, I say Womanjika, Wurundjeri Balak Yimungundibik. That means welcome to the traditional country of the Wurundjeri people. I wish to welcome you from the tops of the trees to the roots in the ground. So when we look after each other and we look after country, Country looks after us. Nungodjan. Thank you.
Thank you, Auntie Di, for those beautiful, beautiful words. So to set the scene for tonight's event, we've got a short performance from Adela's choir, who will sing Peace Talk, a poem written in 1917 by Doris Blackburn and set to music by our conductor, Jeannie Marsh, for the production Serenading Adela, a street opera. So, as we have our choir filing onto the stage, please join me in welcoming Adela's choir. Choir. Well done. Thank you. Thank you, Adela's choir, and accordionist Dave Evans for that beautiful, beautiful performance. I think you set the tone really, really well for the night. I'd now like to introduce the Mayor of Moreland, Councillor John Kavanagh.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight for the 22nd Maurice Blackburn Oration. This is a key event in the Moreland calendar and gives us an opportunity to reaffirm Council's commitment to social justice and human rights and engage in dialogue about issues that are significant both globally and locally. One such issue has been the impact of war, not just in the past but also in the present, that we'll hear more about this evening. I'd also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people as the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I love hearing Auntie Di speak, and the great news is that Auntie Di has recently moved to Moreland too, so it's great to have her in the municipality. Thank you, it's a beautiful welcome. I'd also like to acknowledge my fellow councillors, Councillor Oscar Yordiz and Councillor Sue Bolton, former Mayor Mark Higginbotham, and the former member for Coburg, Peter Gavin, joins us tonight too. So I acknowledge all those as special guests and thank you very much for being here. I warmly also welcome members of the Blackburn family who are with us tonight. It's a great pleasure to welcome our guest speaker, Judy Stacher, and from the Red Cross Australia, who will present the oration tonight on the humanitarian impact of war. The origin of this lecture series is found in the generosity and the spirit of two great Australians, Maurice and Doris Blackburn. Maurice Blackburn devoted his life to social justice, trade union rights, civil liberties and international peace. We are very fortunate tonight that we also have with us tonight Dr. Carolyn Rasmussen, who will set the scene for tonight's oration with a brief overview of the life and work of Maurice and Doris Blackburn, and in particular, Doris Blackburn's contribution to the peace movement. Dr. Rasmussen's work as a public historian since 1985 has ranged over the history of Victorian public institutions, labour history, the history of science and technology, education history, and the involvement of women in all of the above. She's chair of the Victorian Working Party of the Australian Dictionary of Biography and a member of the National Editorial Board. Her most recent book, Shifting the Boundaries, the University of Melbourne from 1975 to 2015. Maurice and Doris Blackburn have featured in Dr. Rasmussen's work since the 1970s, when she wrote a master's thesis on the history of the Coburg branch of the ALP from 1904 to 1940. Her joint biography, Maurice and Doris Blackburn, to be published early next year, is the culmination of many years of deep engagement with the work of the family, and I, for one, are looking forward to purchasing a copy. Dr. Rasmussen delivered the fifth Maurice Blackburn oration in 1991, titled The Man, the Legend, which focused on the life and work of Maurice Blackburn. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Carolyn Rasmussen.
Thank you for the invitation to speak tonight. I'm very honoured to be here and to stand in for two remarkable people who continue to inspire through the medium of these lectures. One of the lesser known facts about Doris is that she was quite an accomplished artist and a poet, although you just heard one. In one of her poems she wrote, "I will build my house on a hilltop, but do not expect me to sit in contentment." These two lines seem especially appropriate tonight, since Doris did indeed build her house on a hill, Coonan's Hill, Pascoe Vale South, in Louisville Avenue, overlooking the Moonee Ponds Creek in 1936. She designed the house herself and closely supervised every detail of its construction. That house on the hill is the foundation of this lecture series, for Doris bequeathed it to the trustees of the State Library of Victoria, one of whom had been Maurice Blackburn from the 1920s till his death in 1944, to establish it as a people's library, in effect a branch library and a neighbourhood house, though the latter concept was still very much in its infancy in 1970. Trouble was, Doris's beloved house and large, highly productive garden was rather out of the way. It's quite a long hike from the Melville Road tram, and it's uphill. The family and her advisors had tried to make her see that this was not the ideal form for her gift, but she could not be dissuaded. It was not too long before the trustees were facing rising maintenance costs and low use, and so parliamentary approval was sought for a variation in the terms of the will, and the result was the sale of the house and the establishment of this lecture series, the first in 1987, and a sum to be expended annually by the now Moreland City Library on books in the areas of social welfare and education. The second line of the poem is appropriate because it encapsulates the public lives of both Doris and Maurice Blackburn. Neither of them could sit in contentment as long as they felt there was something they could do to bring a greater measure of social and economic justice and peace to the world. Now, at the time when this lecture series was set up, Maurice was possibly the better known of the two, but I'll be bold enough to suggest that Doris was overshadowed, if perhaps unconsciously, just because she was a woman. Such a bias would have dismayed both of them, but before I try to redress the balance a little, a quick summary of Maurice's career is in order. Blackburn was the member for Essendon, which included Coburg at the time, in the Victorian Legislative Assembly from 1914 to 1917, when he famously lost the seat due to his opposition to conscription. In 1919, he established the law firm that still bears his name, specialising in the legal needs of working people. He was re-elected to the Assembly in 1923 as the member for Fitzroy, afterwards Clifton Hill, in one of the more colourful elections in Victorian history. In 1934, following a term as Speaker in the Legislative Assembly, he was elected to the federal seat of Burke, covering Brunswick and Coburg, which he held until 1943. Counted among the left wing of the Labor Party, he was twice expelled for following his conscience rather than the dictates of the party. But his fine legal mind and was at all times at the service of the party and anyone suffering some form of injustice. A warm, affable man of simple tastes, but a fierce advocate, at the time of his death he had acquired a legendary status among his followers, who were many. Some might better be described as disciples. Maurice had that effect on people. Maurice Blackburn and Doris Hordern were both grandchildren of Victorian pioneers. Both grew up in genteel poverty. Both were politically minded and public-spirited from an early age. Neither expected to marry until, thrown together in the intense political campaigns of 1913, they fell hopelessly in love. Maurice was a young barrister with political ambitions. Doris, who took first-class honours in senior drawing exams and had taken out her teacher's certificate, was joint campaign secretary for pioneering feminist Vida Goldstein as she tried, yet again unsuccessfully, to win a federal seat in Parliament. It was a valuable learning experience for a young woman who had joined the Women's Political Association 2 years previously and courageously taken to the streets selling the woman voter. In Maurice, she found a political soulmate who was as passionate about women's rights as she was, as well as the needs of the poor and the powerless. War and motherhood, 3 children were born between 1915 and 1921, shifted her focus somewhat, though both sharpened her poetic voice. She fell out with the Women's Political Association over its militant pacifism, preferring instead the more moderate Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, founded in 1915. Motherhood encouraged Doris's interest in progressive education and child psychology, and in the mid-1920s she joined the Citizens Education Fellowship, editing its monthly magazine, The New Outlook, for a number of years. From this time on, articles by her on these subjects were, from time to time, published in the Daily Press and other journals. In 1928, she took on the presidency of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom until the birth of her 4th child in 1931. This infant, born with an inoperable heart defect, died at 13 months, In the same year, Doris's younger sister and father died, leaving her lost and depressed for a time. Internationally minded like Maurice, who was expelled for his refusal to disassociate himself from popular front bodies like the Council Against War and Fascism, Doris was drawn back into public life to work for peace and opposition to fascism in the mid-1930s. The newly invigorated Doris gained her driving licence, bought herself a DeSoto car and built that house on Coonan's Hill, before throwing herself wholeheartedly into the international peace campaign, especially its Women's Commission, while her long-standing interest in the education of young children took her into the Playgrounds Association. Doris supported the failed efforts to form an Anglo-French-Soviet pact to encircle and contain Hitler's Germany, before spending most of the war years looking after friends, family and grandchildren. Also, in 1941, she helped found the Coonan's Hill Kindergarten, now named for her. Her skill in planning, managing contacts and resources, and mobilising the grassroots earned her the undying appreciation of her neighbours. It was a project that provided Doris with enduring satisfaction. She would assist with fundraising and continue to attend committee meetings almost till her death in 1970. There too, she could encourage the children's artwork and enjoy the special rapport she always had with preschool children. She was also supporting Maurice in what became a lonely vigil in opposition to Curtin's total war policy, most especially his extension to the home front out into the southwest Pacific. Blackburn did not oppose conscription for home defence, but this redefinition of home seemed to him a step too far. Blackburn was defeated in 1943 when he stood as independent Labor. Meanwhile, a slow-growing auditory nerve tumour, which had no doubt caused the severe headaches and blackouts he had suffered all his adult life, reached a critical mass at the end of that year, and he died in March 1944. The outrage in the Coburg area at the treatment of Blackburn, along with the success of Charlie Mutton as the member for Coburg against the increasingly Catholic-dominated and authoritarian central executive of the Labor Party, had encouraged the development of a well-organised independent Labor Party in the area. Perhaps if Doris could win back the seat of Burke, there might be some redress. But mostly, she wanted a chance to walk on the bigger political stage herself. Doris Blackburn brought a well-developed and distinctive political identity to her pioneering role as the second woman to sit in the House of Representatives. She was no mere political widow. Doris was a seasoned campaigner, a good speaker and practical debater, a practiced debater, steeled with a blend of conviction and compassion, determination and pragmatism that suited her position on the crossbenches, though she supported the Labor government on all but a handful of occasions. The first time she spoke was to ask, in November 1946, a series of questions about weapons testing, the first move in her sustained and eloquent opposition to the creation of the Woomera rocket range. Her speeches on the 6th of March and the 1st of May 1947 on this issue are among the best delivered in the House for this period. She also spoke extensively on the subject outside Parliament. Beyond this, she quickly established her credibility as an intelligent, articulate politician with a coherent program centred on women's rights, especially in employment, family support, housing, welfare, especially pensions, civil rights, and the need to end the shortage of sugar in the jam-making season. This was a woman who could whip up 75 pounds of marmalade for a fundraising fete. She understood about the sugar. Much less sociable than Maurice, she approached her time in Canberra with great seriousness. A lonely, straight-backed figure, mostly dressed in black, with touches of white at the throat and wrist, who was seldom seen except in the chamber or walking, always alone, with swift nervousness between Parliament House and the Hotel Kurrajong, where most MPs stayed. In 3 years, she missed only one sitting, and in 1947 chose to give her £500 per year parliamentary salary increase to needy constituents. Back in the electorate, Doris maintained close contact with those constituents via quarterly meetings, but when she came to stand again in 1949, the electorate had been divided into two, along with her support base. She chose to stand in Wills, but the new seat extended into Conservative divisions in Essendon, and it was regained on preferences by the ALP. She lost again in 1951. Her view that much could be achieved to improve the social order by chipping away had proved insufficient for walking on a national stage, where independents were crowded aside and women members, as Doris put it astutely, were kept in the background by the domination of men. She was, nevertheless, the realisation of her mentor Vida Goldstein's dream to put a Victorian woman in federal parliament. It had taken nearly half a century. Nothing daunted Doris. She just reframed the means by which she pursued her lifelong work for peace, the extension of women's rights and opportunities, and social and economic justice more generally. Doris was very good at chairing meetings, large and small, and much in demand to address small groups. Throughout the 1950s, she held leadership roles as president of both the Council for Civil Liberties and the Victorian branch of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. For the latter, she travelled to Europe from June 1952 to April 1953 to attend meetings in Switzerland and connect with other branches in England, Scotland and Scandinavia. She was also involved in the United Nations Association, International Women's Day programs, and just about any group or activity with international peace as its object. As the Cold War froze over, this activity was increasingly focused on atomic weapons testing, and she took part in the protest against the Menzies government's attempts to ban the Communist Party. As if that were not enough, she also occupied executive roles with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Howard League for Penal Reform, mainly working to end capital punishment, the Women's Prison Council and Save the Children Fund, among others. But by the end of the decade, it was the plight of Indigenous Australians that occupied the greater part of her attention. From the time of the Woomera Rocket Range protests, Doris had worked closely with national groups working to extend the civil and political rights of Aborigines. From 1949, she worked closely with Pastor Doug Nicholls, initially as he briefly contemplated standing for federal parliament himself, but especially with his plans to establish a hostel in Northcote for Aboriginal girls coming to work in the city, and with the campaigns on behalf of the Warburton Rangers and Lake Tyers Aborigines. She was a foundation executive member of the Victorian Aborigines Advancement League, set up in early 1957 to resist the assimilation policies of the Victorian Aborigines Welfare Board. A year later, she was present at the foundation of the Federal Council for the Advancement of Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders. In 1960, she was president. Though disinclined to seek the limelight, Doris remained a committed executive member of the League almost till her death. But as her energies diminished from the mid-1960s, she increasingly confined herself to work on behalf of the Girls' Hostel and her beloved Coonans Hill Kindergarten. She died on the 12th of December 1970, aged 81. For 9 years following the death of Maurice Blackburn, crowds gathered at his graveside in late March to hear an address by a prominent figure. No such crowds gathered for Doris, though she was cut from the same cloth as her husband. Both in obituaries were hailed as Labor's conscience. But above all, her very presence in federal parliament was a beacon showing the way for following generations. Even in death, she hoped to continue her work with the legacy of her house, a gift to the people of Coburg where they might gather and learn, for to the very end she remained convinced that education was the best means to eliminate war and to give women the resources to take their rightful place in public affairs. 31 years on from that first memorial lecture, it's probable that Doris is now better known than Maurice, thanks to the efforts of a younger generation to bring the achievements of women like her in from the margins and footnotes of history. It's entirely fitting, too, that in 2013, the new officers of the Department of Human Services in Canberra should have been named in her honour. Once again, Doris has her house on the hilltop, and I'm quite sure her ghost is no more inclined to sit there in contentment than the living Doris would have been. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rasmussen, for painting such a warm and thoughtful and thought-provoking picture of Doris and Maurice Blackburn. Thank you. So we're about to move on to our Maurice Blackburn oration, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about our speaker. So Judy Slatcher leads the Australian Red Cross and is dedicated to improving the lives of vulnerable people through mobilising the power of humanity. Judy joined Red Cross in early 2016 after 7 years in Switzerland at the Worldwide Fund for Nature, where she was the global CEO. Judy has worked in the Australian government across a number of portfolios, including transport and communications, finance and social security. Please join me in welcoming Judy to deliver the 22nd Maurice Blackburn oration. Welcome.
Thank you, Narina. What a wonderful hall to be in. I'm ashamed to say that I have never been here, so it's a lovely surprise to see it, and it has a wonderful, warm feeling. You can feel the history in it, and you can imagine the voices and debates that have taken place. It is an honour to be here tonight, and we were very humbled when we were asked to give the oration, and we have spent a lot of time thinking about what we want to say on the important subject of the humanitarian impact of war. Before I start, I would like to pay my respect to and acknowledge the Wurundjeri peoples, the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, and I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge any members of the Blackburn family here tonight, the Mayor, Narina, and of course other speakers and members of Parliament. For over 100 years, strong and passionate women have played a leading role in the Red Cross as we pursue our commitment to human dignity, peace, safety and well-being for all. And as we have just heard, when I read about the life of Doris Blackburn, I'm reminded of these women. From her presidency of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, through to her focus on weaponry and particular nuclear, very early days of nuclear, through to empowering women and Indigenous peoples and her role in government, she was a major influence on the issues that matter to the lives of Australians and many around the world. We were pretty impressed to read about her, and it was really great to hear more of that history. I can imagine being a solitary figure in Parliament House because it's a very, very big place, and I can imagine how she would have felt there as she, often on her own, took on causes that many others would shy away from. Similarly, Maurice Blackburn strongly shaped Australia through his dedication and commitment on critical matters, from social justice, workers' rights to international peace. On many occasions, he also challenged the view of what was right, in inverted commas, to build a more socially equitable Australia. What a powerful contribution they have made in the last century, and what a tremendous legacy they have left, and through their family and their initiatives, keep alive. So, to the topic of the humanitarian impact of war. Today, millions and millions of people just like you and me, are trying their best to go about their lives while living in war zones. Conflicts around the world are tearing families apart and forcing people to flee from their homes and loved ones in the hope of finding safety elsewhere. In Syria alone, some 12 million people, that's 65% of the population, are internally displaced or living outside their country as refugees. At the same time, millions of children are growing up knowing nothing but war. In fact, 27 million children are out of school due to conflict. Let's just really comprehend that for a minute. 27 million children are missing school because of conflict and war, and as a result, being denied an education. 65 million people in total have been displaced by war and conflict. Many of these conflicts have dragged on for at least half a decade with a diverse and complex mix of warring parties. The causes are complex and multifaceted. So the humanitarian impact on all of those people is great. In a moment, I will talk about the potential future impact of war and what the future of war might look like. But let us first talk about what we see today as the most critical issues facing humanitarian matters in relation to war. The first is the protection of medical and humanitarian personnel, and you might find it weird that I first talk about humanitarian workers, but actually they are the ones that do the work that then help the civilians that need the help, or those who've left the fighting that need support. The protection of medical facilities and personnel in times of war is a critical issue the humanitarian community is grappling with, all of us, whether it's Red Cross, Médecins Sans Frontières and others. The protection of healthcare facilities, that's hospitals and clinics, and healthcare workers, doctors and nurses, is at the core of modern international war, yet it's in trouble. Attacks on healthcare in all its forms is prohibited under the laws of war, yet every day around the world, medical personnel, patients and medical facilities come under attack. Hospitals and ambulances are deliberately or accidentally targeted, medical facilities misused, doctors, nurses, patients are threatened or attacked, and civilian access to medical services is blocked or delayed or completely denied. In the last 2 years alone, every week there has been an incident of violence against a healthcare facility or personnel in a conflict zone. In these last 2 years, the International Committee of the Red Cross registered more than 1,200 cases of violence against healthcare facilities and personnel in 16 countries alone. Just in May, a German nurse working for the International Red Cross was abducted by armed men in Mogadishu. That same month, armed men stormed a hospital in the Central African Republic where the International Red Cross surgical teams operate, threatening patients, medical staff and Red Cross volunteers. An ambulance was stopped and threatened in the street. And this barely scrapes the surface of what happens everywhere around the world every week. This has far-reaching consequences as doctors and nurses flee their posts, hospitals close, and vaccination campaigns come to a halt. These can leave entire communities without access to adequate medical services. Violence, both real and threatened, against patients and healthcare workers and facilities is one of the most important yet overlooked humanitarian issues of conflict today. The second major humanitarian area of impact and change is relating to urban warfare. Cities have never been immune from war, but over the last century, more than half of the world's population have moved to cities, and armed conflicts have increasingly been sought and fought in populated areas. Think of Gaza, think of Mosul in Iraq, think of Mogadishu in Somalia. This puts civilians at greater risk of death, injury and displacement. And we believe this trend is going to continue as urbanisation around the world intensifies. To make matters worse, fighters in these conflicts often avoid facing their enemies in the open, instead mingling with civilian populations. And this is particularly true of non-state armed actors. At the same time, armed conflicts continue to be fought with weapons designed to be used in the open and not used in cities. They're designed to be used in battlefields, fields. When these weapons are used against military targets in populated areas, the effects are likely to be indiscriminate, often with devastating consequences for civilians. I think we all remember the photo of that little boy in the ambulance covered in dust. It was quite heart-wrenching. When wars are fought in densely populated areas, the first obvious consequence is that more people will be killed and injured. However, when hospitals are destroyed, because hospitals are in cities, there just won't be treatment. There is not treatment for those who are injured, which means more illness, more people living with disabilities, more suffering and more deaths. Further, city supplies, like the all-important water and electricity grids, are likely to be disrupted, in fact decimated. These cities are critical systems for the whole system to depend on. The chance of epidemics increases, more people are displaced, more people need to flee. The effects spiral on. The third area that we think is an acute issue as we talk tonight is that of nuclear weapons, something obviously very close to Doris's heart, and perhaps we all wish she'd been more successful in her efforts. It is an existential threat hanging over our heads. Our world changed forever on the 6th of August 1945 when a white flash appeared over Hiroshima in Japan. A nuclear weapon had been detonated over the city. An assessment later found that as well as complete destruction of medical facilities, equipment and supplies in the city, approximately 90% approximately 90% of the medical profession and 80% of pharmacists in Hiroshima had been killed or injured in the blast. There are other stories to tell, not as devastating as those of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but important to share. In our own part of the world, in Australia and the Pacific, we have our own tragedies to add to those in Japan. Between 1952 and 1963, there were 12 major nuclear weapon detonations in Australia. In the South Australian outback and off the coast of Western Australia. The impact of on Aboriginal communities living in the areas of the testing, many of them not warned, continues today. The use of nuclear weapons goes against all central tenets of the laws of war. These weapons cannot distinguish between combatants and civilians. Their effects cannot be limited in space or time. So destructive that there is no effective humanitarian response. Humanitarian organisations like the Red Cross and others simply would not be able to cope with the scale of injuries and deaths in the event of a nuclear detonation. We in the Red Cross movement find it difficult to envisage a situation in which the use of these weapons would be consistent with the laws of war, and does not believe that any action could be effective, which is why we think it is such a threat. Yet many nuclear weapon states are modernising their arsenals with enough weapons on trigger alert to obliterate our planet, our home, several times. So that's a bit depressing, isn't it? Let me, before we talk about what possible answers might be to these impacts, I do want to talk about looking to the future, because the future is coming very fast at us. So if we take these challenges I have just outlined, we add to this the undeniable fact that the nature of war is fundamentally changing. What will the battlefields of tomorrow look like? Where and how will wars be fought? And by whom and with what weapons? How will communities and individuals be impacted? And what will be the nature of the humanitarian impacts of war? Technological advancements in medicine, power sources, and the way people communicate day to day will all impact on the way civilians experience conflict. Indeed, the whole fourth industrial revolution coming our way will generate significant change in societies. We know that robotics, big data, artificial intelligence, human enhancement, will change the face of war forever. We are starting to see these changes playing out in so many areas of life already, and we need to anticipate them and understand their impact. For example, right now, one of the major issues being debated globally is how much autonomy to give a weapons system. What happens when a weapon becomes so sophisticated it can make its own decisions on who to target and how, without any human intervention beyond initial programming? Some people think there's actually a duty for countries who have the resources and capacity to do so to develop new technology if it can reduce the impact of conflict and the impact of one's own forces using technology. So there's also an upside. Another opinion is that autonomous weapons systems may only have limited ability to comply with the rules of law. And many of the advantages foreseen in using these weapons could instead be used weapons that are remotely operated under human control, for example, drones. There is also a debate about whether the principles of humanity and the dictates of public conscience would or should permit life and death decisions to be made by a machine. If someone is a lawful target, does it matter how they are killed and who or what makes that assessment? Does respecting human dignity mean that the decision to lawfully take someone's life must remain with humans and cannot be delegated to a piece of hardware? And if something goes wrong, who is accountable for a war crime committed by a robot that made an incorrect assessment? Another big issue is the very real possibility of war in space. The Dean of the Law School at the University of Adelaide recently said, "Conflict in outer space is not a case of if, but when." And it makes sense, as one of our long-serving Red Cross International Law volunteers put it nicely when he explained that space is a key enabler of communications, surveillance, early warning and navigation systems, and it is a critical security and conflict domain. Cyber war is another challenge that is already well and truly upon us. I think we're seeing the impacts in many places. It will only increase in scale and complexity. When you consider the potential of using cyber attacks to target, for example, oil pipeline flow systems, nuclear plants, electrical grids, or even air traffic control systems, the enormous humanitarian challenges become immediately apparent. Another area throwing up the ethical questions is human enhancement. As one commentator put it, we know enough about biology, neuroscience, computing, robotics and materials to hack the human body, reshaping it in our own image, and defence-related applications are a major driver of research in science and technology. What all this means for the humanitarian impact of war is exercising the minds of many people, including us in the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement. There are, of course, no easy answers, no silver bullets. However, we do see some potential paths forward. The first is, and I'm going to talk about three, the first is greater adherence to the laws of war. War and our attempts to regulate it are as old as humanity itself. From the ancient Greeks to Mesopotamia to the island nations of the Pacific, cultural practices reflecting the principles behind international humanitarian law, or the laws of war, have existed for millennia. When the modern idea of codified laws of war was negotiated in Western Europe by Henri Dunant, the founder of Red Cross, just over 150 years ago, he recognised the humanitarian consequences of war and aimed to alleviate suffering on the battlefield through the laws of war. The laws of war protect people who are not or are no longer taking part in the conflict. They place limits on the ways which wars are fought. This means certain groups of people, the wounded and the sick armed forces, prisoners of war and of course civilians, should not be a target of an attack. The laws of war say you must not use weapons that can't distinguish between a military target and a civilian target. And you must not use weapons that are disproportionate in the incidental civilian damage they cause, like a nuclear weapon is. These laws of war also give the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement a very particular role and function in times of conflict, and a responsibility to inform, to educate and ensure the respect for these laws around the world. Today, in 191 different countries around the world, our job is to predict what the next challenge might be and to prepare for it through the laws of war. Having said that, though, today's modern conflicts are putting an unprecedented strain on these laws. One of the founders of the Red Cross, a lawyer named Gustav Moynihan, said back in 1872 that whilst the codification of the laws of war was a real step forward, there would likely need to be some sort of international court to enforce them. 130 years later, the International Criminal Court came into being. Our collective challenge is how to have this same foresight and look at how the battlefield, now more likely to be in a city than a field, and perhaps even the moon, will evolve for the next 150 years, and to ensure that the laws of war continue to protect people every day in the darkest circumstances of human creation. I would like to think that what drove Moynihan's foresight was not just a love of law, but for the law itself. But rather than abiding a concern for the human condition and to bring a little more humanity to places where it is needed most, and of course, just a good old dose of common sense. We believe that international humanitarian law is one set of tools we must continue to use in order to limit the excesses of war that we see today. They give us the minimum principles of respect and dignity. They talk about the really obvious and common sense elements, such as citizens should not be targeted. Many people directly facing armed conflict agree with us. In 2016, the International Committee of the Red Cross conducted a survey to gauge public opinion on issues relating to international law, humanitarian law. The results clearly showed that people living in countries affected by armed conflict believe that law matters, that the Geneva Conventions are still relevant today, and they prevent wars from escalating. However, these results also showed that a higher proportion of people living in non-conflict affected areas, like Australia, were more accepting of civilian deaths in conflict zone as an inevitable part of war and didn't understand the importance of law, the laws of war. This is why we need to keep our job and keep our focus on ensuring the understanding and the impact and the humanitarian benefits that the laws of war bring. I just wanted to touch on a few examples about the laws of war working. One classic is Almost Every Day, where humanitarian missions are granted access to people affected by armed conflict. The laws of war are silently working in the background. These are things that never get publicity and that never get attention, but they happen every day. Some of the more publicised benefits of the law of war include, for example, in Colombia, during and after the ongoing conflict between Colombian governments and the FARC, the guerrilla movement, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, several deals have been made between the parties to allow for the efficient search, identification and delivery of the remains of people deemed missing in the conflict. I think we all understand that a country's ability to heal from the war is as much about honesty and truth and reconciliation and recovery as it is about the war stopping itself. In Libya, after social unrest escalated into armed conflict in 2011, authorities permitted the International Red Cross to visit detention facilities and detainees of their choice. During that same conflict, the Libyan National Transitional Council launched a manual on the rules of armed conflict and distributed it, including sending parts of it as text messages to mobile phones and broadcasting parts of it non-stop on radio and TV. In the Philippines, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front unilaterally committed to a total ban on anti-personnel mines in its conflict with the government of the Philippines. Its commitment is used as an example for other non-state armed groups in the Philippines. And finally, on nuclear weapons, just last year, following more than 2 decades of paralysis in the disarmament negotiations, 122 states voted to adopt a landmark agreement to eliminate nuclear weapons forever. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is the first ever globally applicable multilateral agreement to comprehensively prohibit nuclear weapons. And I think you might all remember that Australia's very own ICANN won the Nobel Peace Prize for its role in ensuring that this agreement came into place. So we need to foster change in the way we talk about, teach and research international humanitarian law so that we do not ignore the suffering of victims of armed conflict, particularly when the law is violated. And we also need to make sure that we do not chip away at the credibility of these laws that every day prove themselves to be effective in alleviating human suffering and conflict. So that's the first. How to minimise the impact of war, however it is, whatever its guises, through the laws of war. The second is around technology for good. It relates to the growing move to ensure that technology is a force for good as the world shifts into the fourth industrial revolution. Just last week, the Human Rights Commission held an international conference on human rights and technology. It was about the implications of unprecedented technological change and launched a major research project that will look to the impact and opportunities of new technologies to protect and promote our rights and freedoms. It will investigate initiatives such as artificial intelligence, algorithmic bias, big data, inclusive technology, and the intersection between technology, free speech, and democracy. In the words of the President of the Australian Human Rights Commission, distinguished Professor Rosalind Croucher, we must focus on the principles of security, responsibility, integrity, inclusivity, and especially humanity, because it is without the last that we will be abandoning all hope in this digital revolution. We are already working solidly on this in the Australian Red Cross. We have developed an initiative called Humanitech, which is about the intersection of humanity and technology to deliver humanitarian outcomes. Humanitech will bring together the best minds working at the intersection of technology and social innovation. They will explore the role of emerging technology in better meeting humanitarian needs and to pioneer solutions through sharing, collaboration, and experimentation. And while a huge generalisation, humanitarian action in times of conflict for the past century has perhaps focused more on the most basic of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, shelter and food, whereas maybe this century it might translate to a digital hierarchy of needs around security, identity and dignity. These are the things we are exploring in Humanitech. For example, through satellite images and on-the-ground drone footage and crowdsourced mapping, how can we actually give better early warning systems? How can we improve humanitarian responses so that they are better targeted? A specific example is how to use a hackathon to develop ideas as a happy children application to support children made as amputees through violence and conflict. On identity, which is about ensuring that all people have access to self-sovereign and portable digital identity as a foundation for civic and economic participation and the fleeing of wars. For example, the International Committee of the Red Cross and the UN are exploring ways to use blockchain to provide legal identity to undocumented people, paving a way for them to access fundamental protection and services. And more importantly, if they are fleeing war, so that they own their identity and they're not having to hand it over and they can give access to it but retain ownership of it and control. Equally, as I speak, the International Committee of the Red Cross and Microsoft are working towards facial recognition technology to help reunite families separated by conflict. Another example, during protracted conflicts, technology may provide new opportunities to ensure access to education for children in conflict zones. All of these things represent what we are exploring in Humanitech, and we're actually quite excited about it. The third possible pathway to improve the humanitarian impact of war is through partnering for greater impact. There are a diversity of actors in conflict zones, not just local populations, armed fighters and humanitarians. Private entrepreneurs are increasingly present in conflict zones, and whilst many are demonstrating their commitment to conduct activities in a conflict-sensitive manner, particularly in relation to human rights obligations, there is a growing global acknowledgement of both the positive and negative impacts that businesses have on armed conflict and other situations of violence. And there are examples of businesses and the private sector playing a significant social, political and economic role in the conflict situations, such as providing valuable services to civilian populations in times of war. Australian companies, from mining and resources to finance, tech and communications, as well as medical service providers, are increasingly exposed to these conflict-affected areas around the globe, primarily due to the proximity of business operations to war zones and through hiring private security forces when operating in insecure environments. How can we leverage this to improve the humanitarian impact of work? How can we build partnerships which help to create more positive humanitarian outcomes for local populations? How can we shift the understanding and respect for international laws of humanitarian laws of war in the private sector? For example, companies can improve their role by embedding international humanitarian law capability and capacity through their workforces. Law firms and professional service firms can influence companies to integrate international humanitarian law into their already well-established human rights and corporate social responsibility plans. And finally, regulators and policymakers have a very important role where they can embed, for example, in the ASX's Global Reporting Initiative, embed international humanitarian law so that it applies to companies operating in conflict zones. With all three of these opportunities, the continued application of international humanitarian law, the development of technology for social good, and partnering to reduce the impact of war, we seek to mitigate the humanitarian impact of war. We at the Red Cross want to provide foresight that's grounded in pragmatism and driven by commitment and belief in humanity above all else. We will push ourselves to predict issues ahead of time and to connect the dots between different emerging trends like the ones I have spoken about earlier. For example, what happens when counter-terrorism measures and its legal framework, which, by the way, is challenging our entire humanitarian system and Red Cross's capacity to help people in a neutral, impartial way, what happens when that framework meets the laws of space? How do autonomous weapons square off with cyber warfare? And what are the second, third, fourth tier unintended or unforeseen consequences, humanitarian consequences of these developments? These are the things we are pushing ourselves to seek to understand and to seek to respond to. Discussions about the challenges on our doorstep today, tomorrow, and in 50 or 100 years from now are vital. It's clear the world is changing at such a rapid rate in so many areas, and the ways in which wars are fought, won, and lost are not immune from the technological, scientific, and other advancements happening, particularly in other fields of endeavour. For us, the principle of humanity is at the core of everything that matters. In all spheres of life, in times of peace and in times of war. In every country of the world, there must be humanity on the battlefield, and we must do all we can to limit suffering. We live in a new era. It is not a peaceful one. As I said at the beginning, armed conflicts are tearing apart vast swathes of our world. Millions of people live without adequate water, food, shelter and healthcare because of war. Millions of children will never receive an education because conflict has been present their entire lives. Hospital and medical workers are being attacked. It has never been so urgent to reach people about the importance of embedding the 3 changes that I talked about: international humanitarian law, technology for good, and partnering for good humanitarian outcomes, even during times of conflict, and of acting with humanity and preserving human dignity. We must continue to promote, respect and protect the laws of war, and we must never stop, because wars without laws are wars without limits, and wars without limits herald an era of what it means to be part of a shared, and wars without limits heralds the end of an era of what it means to have shared common humanity. So let's also together make the most of this growing focus on what can be done to limit the humanitarian impact of war, what can be done to reinforce social good, empowerment and self-agency in times of war and conflict and in our everyday lives. And I think that brings us right back to the Blackburns, whom we are honouring here tonight, 2 people who lived their lives to build a stronger, more equitable society. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy, for your thought-provoking words. You've really illustrated the importance of the work of the Red Cross, both on a really global scale with those huge challenges around technology and I guess warfare in the future, and technology for good. So huge global challenges, while at the same time the day-to-day and often unseen humanitarian work that's done to relieve people in their everyday lives. So thank you so much for painting that picture for us. On behalf of Moreland, I'd like to thank you for sharing those reflections, and I'll take this opportunity to just say goodbye to our viewers at home who will finish our live stream right now, so thank you for joining us.